So staying perhaps a little bit in theme with being below ground, our final speaker in today's session is Simon Holdaway. So I'm being very coarse in characterising archaeologists as below ground, so apologies for rather looseness there, Simon. Simon Holdaway from the University of Auckland, who's going to speak to us on From Simple to Complex, an archaeological antidote to unilineal culture history. So take it away.
Thank you. And thanks so much for having such a learned audience here. So I'm going to see if I can go. You know, if you open almost any textbook or popular account of the human past, you'll get a progression a little bit like this. You can see on your left there, hunter-gatherers collecting wild plants and animals from around the landscape. And these people will be characterised as relatively simple organisation, social organisation, and an awful lot of movement. You'll then read about a transition with the development of domesticated plants and animals, illustrated here by some domestic goats and indeed some barley and wheat barley we heard about a little bit earlier. These people are less mobile, they live in villages, but they have a little bit more complex social organisation. They do things like store food, and therefore you see the origins of private property. You move on further, you'll get into complex society, and I've tried to characterise this by some iconography from Egypt. This is the Scorpion King mace head, if you're into such things. And those people will have much more complex social organisation. They live in towns and villages. They have complex artworks and such. This progression is supposed to be applied to all peoples at all times all around the world. And I guess much of my research career has been trying to take apart such ideas, really looking a little bit at their colonial origins, but particularly looking at the complexity of the archaeological record that's developed in many places and times. You know, if you talk to many archaeologists, they are specialists in one particular area. And I guess I'm a little bit unusual because I've moved around different parts of the world, really because I'm so interested in the archaeological record left by hunter-gatherer peoples and indeed Neolithic peoples, those people that were supposed to be a little bit more sedentary and look at domestic plants and animals. So I've worked in outback Australia, all around Broken Hill. I've worked in the tropics of Australia, up in the top of Cape York, at a town called Weipa. I've worked in Egypt, I guess that kind of classic place for archaeology, near an ancient lake called Lake Karun. And in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I've worked a whole lot on Great Mercury Island, Ahu. And I just got back last week from the Auckland Islands, way down south. And what I've been interested in all these places is to think about human settlements, how that's changed, how to look at the complexity of people through time, looking at those notions, those kind of traditional shifts between hunter-gatherers, simple social organisation, into Neolithic with the proposal of more complex organisation. But I've done this looking at portable material culture. You thought I might have perhaps looked at houses, but the difficulty, I guess, with looking at settlement with houses, as many of us know that live in lovely old villas, the houses kind of outlast individuals. I've looked instead at portable material culture, those things that people use and reuse many times, and I've focused on stone. Why stone? Because you find stone preserved in archaeological sites all around the world. It was a key technology early on. People picked up cobbles of stone and they broke these open with stone, wooden, and at times bone, hammers, making stone flakes. In our world, I guess the analogy is that wonderful rock that's flicked up by the car in front of you and hits your windscreen and kind of shatters your windscreen. If you look very closely at the strike of the stone, you'll see that it flakes in a way that's very similar to the way people flake stone in the past. Now, stone's a fantastic material. It occurs in archaeological sites all around the world. It's super abundant. Certainly you can tell how people made and used stone tools, but it turns out you can do a bunch of other things as well. You can look at mobility, and that's because people around the world tended to pick up cobbles of stone about the size of my fist, or in the picture here you see on the screen, about the size of an apple. And often they source this stone from areas from alluvial deposits, from stream areas where the stone was kind of wrapped in a skin called cortex. A cobble about the size of my fist, all covered in that skin, a little bit about the same as the size of an apple, and they flaked this cobble to produce a whole series of flakes. Now, it turns out you can use some pretty simple geometry to look at the amount of skin of the cortex on a cobble that remains archaeologically and compare it to the number of cobbles that were probably flaked. And you can set up a little ratio, and I've tried to illustrate here with the analogy to an apple. Imagine finding a whole series of apples where most of the apple flesh has been removed. It's taken away and you only have the cores. That suggests people have moved things away. Compare that to a set of stone artefacts where you have more of the outside of the cobble than you expect. That suggests things that have been added. And of course, you've got the third case, you've just about got the amount of pieces of those apple that would account for the number that have been flaked. This gives us a way of measuring mobility. And I've applied this to a whole series of areas, many of those not actually involved in looking at anything under the ground at all. And that is because I've exploited some areas around the world. Egypt's one of them, where you have just huge numbers of stone artefacts scattered across the surface. We looked at this area adjacent to an ancient lake surface about 80 kilometres south of Giza, and I painstakingly mapped out the location of thousands of artefacts. Those lovely little nails are there, mapped them all in these kind of cross like survey areas, dozens of these across the ancient surface. And what we showed is that despite this area being characterised as Neolithic, people are supposed to be settled, they're supposed to be developing those kind of village-like constructions. Actually, they weren't. They were really highly mobile. That wonderful ratio, the apple analogy, was a lot less than one, suggesting people moving things all over the place. I applied the same techniques in Australia, similar sort of areas. You can see all those sort of white flecks in the lovely eroded area there. Those are all stone artefacts. We mapped out the location with a whole lot of electronic aid, some surveying equipment, picked up all those artefacts, analysed them, didn't need to dig anything, put them back again, and showed that same high level of mobility, even in times when many colleagues have argued that climate change in Australia was forcing people to be a lot more sedentary. The point of all this research was starting to defeat some of those models that suggest there's a uniform kind of progression in change. Other things we've looked at are the use of domestic plants and animals. It's suggested with the Neolithic, for instance, that the arrival of domestic plants and animals, sheep, goat, cattle in Egypt, wheat and barley, occurred very early in the area that I was studying, and this led to social changes that would eventually lead to the kind of social organisation that you see in dynastic Egypt. We looked at the nature of all these faunal remains, certainly the evidence of domesticated plants and animals, but also some fantastic evidence that was also lying on the surface. You can see in the top right there, fish bones that have sat on the desert there for 6,000 years, relatively undisturbed. Recreating the economy there, certainly domestic animals, plants and animals were present, but people hadn't changed from the time periods before those species arrived. They were pretty much fishing people, exploiting the lake at that time was at much higher stands. Again, trying to break that notion that these people must have been relatively sedentary. That work that I talked about a little bit in the top of Queensland, way up on the town of Weipa, was looking at huge shell mounds where Aboriginal people had collected shellfish species, a little bit like peppies and cockles that we'd found today. Formed shell mounds, some of these that are higher than the ceiling in this room. We put trenches that you can see there into a large number of these mounds. We dated them. We very carefully analysed the sediments that came out of these mounds and showed that they weren't really intensive occupations where people, for instance, were collecting large numbers of shellfish for big ceremonies and that sort of thing that had been predicted. Instead, these were accumulations that occurred over long periods of time with a lot of changes in the shape of the mounds due to really degradation of those sediments reforming the mounds. Again, kind of knocking out some of the ideas. My work in Aotearoa, as I said, was just got back from an expedition to Enderby Island in the Auckland Island group last week. A fantastic area to do archaeology. You can see some of the pictures of our research team working on that area. This is part of a research project that's looking at the offshore islands from the tropics all the way down to the subantarctic, really looking at that notion of the past in Aotearoa that characterises the south as an area that's full of hunters, often of moa, for instance, and the north as areas that are really dominated by horticulture. What we're showing is that indeed Māori in the far north and the south manipulated their environment in a whole lot of different ways. Some certainly in the north using imported tropical plants like kumara and taro, but across the whole diversity of New Zealand, also manipulating indigenous plants and the environments to encourage animal species. So I guess in conclusion, my research really has tried to tackle that notion of a universal unilinear shift in the way that people work, lived, and the way societies were constructed in the past. You know, what we see when you look at the archaeological record is a fantastic diversity rather than a uniform set of changes. It's fantastic to get this fellowship, but as you'll see from the pictures, all of my research involves major teams, both of my students, many of whom are scholars in their own right. So I have to really acknowledge in accepting the fellowship, the contribution that they have all made. There's no way you can do archaeology in the modern world on your own. Thanks so much for this.
We have got a couple of minutes for questions, so very happy to take that bit of time now. How does, sorry, Karen, and then,
So, in a society that moves around and we're one that's in one spot, can you tell by the way that the stones have been cut?
Yeah, it's really, I guess, the way we did it was to use some geometry. Because what the issue in the past is you've got to find techniques that don't involve you interpreting what you think objects were used for in the past, because, of course, the way they were used was very much at the discretion of those who used them, who indeed made and used them in the past. So what we've tried to do is to use some uniformitarian principles, geometry, for instance, the composition of rocks, and apply those to think up techniques, measures, if you like, that can be used as proxies for mobility. So the apple analogy, if you've got too many pieces of apple, given the number of cores, something has to be brought in. Who did the bringing? People do the bringing, must be mobility. Similarly, if something's removed, there's too little surface area for the number of cores, something must have been taken away. So you get an analogy for movement. And if you apply that over big enough areas, you can start to model the way that people's interacted with environments through time.
I was just wondering whether, I guess there's quite a lot around things like the Little Ice Age and things like that, whether what might have been done from more, what should we say, stratigraphic points of view, or do you see some of those sorts of things, some of these regressive or rapid change events?
Yeah, climate change and things like the Little Ice Age. Colleagues in archaeology, because there's been such fantastic work being done in paleoenvironmental reconstruction, have spent a lot of time kind of correlating shifts and said, well, there's been a big environmental change. Things like about 8,200 years ago, for instance, there's a bit of a blip back towards an ice age, and people said, well, that might have encouraged people, for instance, to take on domesticated plants and animals. The difficulty with that is as you expand those data sets, you start being able to look at correlations not of just one site, but lots and lots of sites. And with those bigger sets of correlations, what you find is that the climate signatures have a hard time explaining change. Things are a lot more variable. They're not in a regular kind of series. And I think that's probably true in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There's been arguments about the Little Ice Age here, for instance, shortly after Māori people arrived in Aotearoa, there's a bit of a shift in climate, right? Which you can see in a set of climate proxies. How much impact that really had, I think, is a bit debatable. And again, because you need to look at variance right across the north-south kind of transition, and be pretty careful in those proxies that you're using. Using those kind of geometric ones that you can really be sure operated in the same way in the past, for example.
So those shell mountains, so they put a long period of time with different shapes within those mountains. So moving around, why is they keep coming back and depositing shells in the same place?
Yeah, it's a really good question, isn't it? It's why mound up the shell when you apparently got a lot of kind of area to work with. There's some really interesting analogues in Senegal, actually, in West Africa that provide one kind of answer. And that is, if you spread shell around all over your shoreline, right, it's quite difficult to live on. It's quite sharp and quite difficult to work. Whereas if you pile it up, you get a number of things. You leave a lot of the beach open, and sometimes you can do activities on top of it because it drains really well. So it's an example of people in the past making their environment, which again gets away from this kind of hunter-gatherer thing idea where societies were totally at the whim of whatever the environment was doing, versus those where people actually began to engineer it.
That's one last question.
Yep,
on
sure.
the slide that you showed the mapping out so meticulously the pieces on the top in Egypt, do you leave all those things there doing mapping, or do you take them away to look at them?
It's a really good question. A senior Barkagee Aboriginal gentleman, Mr. Badger Bates, many years ago when I was first starting wanting to work in Australia, I went to see him because I was working on his land to talk to him about whether I could have permission. And he said, Simon, you white archaeologists, you come to our place and you take all our artefacts away and you stick them in museums. I don't want you to do that. And I went, okay, that's a challenge. So we figured out a system right when portable computers were coming in to move the entire lab out into the field. And Mr. Bates's advice was the best advice I ever had because it allowed us to do all of our analysis in place. We put all the data, I am into data even though I do history a little bit, through a geographic information system. And we'd come out of the field at the end of each season with a complete data set, having picked up the artefact, having mapped it in 3 dimensions, analysed about 20 to 30 attributes into portable computers. I think I used HP 200LXs originally, really dated, and put the artefact back. Of course, we had all the database built. We didn't have to do any lab analysis afterwards. So I took those techniques and we applied them in Egypt. We left all the material where we found it. So it was fantastic advice. I owe Mr. Bates so much. And I've seen him over the years and told him, yes, that was really good, what you suggested.
So thank you very much indeed.
Our pleasure.